Hello, I am Fanny Châles, a PhD student in marine economics at the University of Western Brittany in France. And I am pleased to present to you some research findings on coastal ecosystem services assessments in the small island developing states of the Pacific. So thank you for this opportunity. According to the IPCC, the small island developing states of the Pacific are highly vulnerable to climate change impacts and also to natural degradation loss, in particular in coastal areas where population density is high. In this context, there is a need in Pacific SIDS both to enhance coastal ecosystems protection and restoration, while maintaining and develop socioeconomic coastal activities, such as tourism. It was shown that the assessment of ecosystem services is a relevant tool to help assess trade-offs between these two priorities. In addition, to implement sustainable development activities or conservation projects, Pacific SIDS rely partly on international finance, and it has been shown that providing a clear knowledge of ecosystem services to people is likely to enhance the country's chances of getting funded for natural climate resilience-based projects. So in this context, we asked ourselves the question, what is the state of literature on coastal ecosystem services in Pacific SIDS? And by coastal ecosystems, we include mangroves, coral reefs, and seagrasses ecosystems as they are emblematic coastal ecosystems in these countries. So the aim of our study was to provide an overview of what is known about coastal ecosystem services in the Pacific SIDS in order to identify literature gaps in terms of what services are least assessed and through which methodology and where, etc. To answer this question, we conducted a systematic review of literature following 3 steps. So step 1. First of all, we based our systematic review of literature on 3 inclusion criteria. The first criterion concerns the type of ecosystem reviewed by selecting only reports or peer-reviewed publication mentioning mangroves or coral reefs or seagrasses, or both. Secondly, our geographical scope is confined to the 15 Pacific small island developing states, which are independent countries, members of the Alliance of Small Island States. And finally, inclusion criterion 3, what did we consider being an ecosystem service? So during the full reading of papers, we identified an ecosystem service if it meets the 3 following conditions. First, it is the contribution of an ecosystem to the well-being of human population. It means that human benefits are explicitly identified. Condition 2, this contribution is related to an identifiable coastal ecosystem part of our scope, meaning mangroves, coral reefs, or seagrasses, or both. And condition 3, this positive contribution must be related to an identifiable delimited area, such as a country, or a city, or a portion of coastline, for instance. We considered both peer-reviewed literature and reports. And based on the 3 inclusion criteria, the systematic literature review resulted in 57 studies containing coastal ecosystem services. And there were 26 peer-reviewed publications and 31 reports. In these studies, we identified 292 coastal ecosystem services. Then for each study, we reported and classified the data we were interested in, such as the type of ecosystem or the valuation method, for instance, in an Excel database. One result is that there is heterogeneity both across regions and across ecosystems. As you can see on the first graph on the left, there were a lot of more studies assessing coastal ecosystem services in Melanesia than in Micronesia or in Polynesia. And coral reefs, in blue, were more assessed than mangroves and seagrasses. Also, we found that seagrasses services were increasingly assessed in recent years in Pacific SIDS. On the second graph on the right, we represented the number of ecosystem services by categories of services for all types of ecosystems. So categories refer to common categories defined by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, meaning the provisioning, the regulating and supporting, and the cultural services categories. So we found that there were almost the same number of cultural and provisioning services, and rarely some ecosystem services were not specific to a given ecosystem, but corresponded to several ecosystems. These services are represented as combined here. More specifically, if we go deeper into the different categories of services, we found that food and opportunities for recreation and tourism are the most assessed services. Here it is important to say that we didn't only take into account services that were assessed in economic terms. Based on our definition of an ecosystem service, ecosystem services assessment can include non-economic valuations, such as qualitative assessment, for instance. That is why we use the word assess instead of value. So we found that many services were not assessed in monetary terms. This can be explained in part because the majority of coastal ecosystem services are not market, hence difficult to value monetarily. Therefore, to see how authors of the 57 studies did capture the importance of coastal ecosystem services, we classified the ecosystem services into 3 categories according to whether they were assessed monetarily or quantitatively, but non-monetarily or qualitatively. Here are some examples of how services were assessed according to these 3 categories of assessments. We made a focus on cultural services because their contributions to human well-being is often underestimated, as common methodologies fail to capture them. We were particularly interested in analyzing how cultural services were assessed in Pacific countries because it was shown by Aswani et al. That Pacific people are culturally and spiritually very attached to nature. So cultural services were assessed in 65% of the studies, and they represent 35% of all services identified in our review. So I'm sorry, all is not on the graph. Sorry for that. I don't know why. But so 1/3 of the cultural ecosystem services identified relate to recreation and tourism services, and 17% relate to inspiration for cultural art and design, and 13%, you can't see on the graph, but they relate to existence and bequest values, so for the future. If we compare the first and the second pie charts, we see that cultural services were more often assessed qualitatively compared to when we take into account all the categories of services. So here, compared to that. And if we compare the second and the third pie charts, we see that the tourism services, which are parts of the cultural category, explain why the percentage of cultural services assessed monetarily is higher than the percentage of cultural services assessed qualitatively. Indeed, when we do not take into account tourism services, the percentage of cultural services assessed in monetary terms here falls to 41%. And the percentage of those assessed in qualitative terms increases up to 49%. So on one hand, although the services described qualitatively can reflect extremely valuable services to people, this qualitative description is often not suited to adequately inform decision-making processes. And on the other hand, monetary evaluations can be time and resource intensive. So as a result, de Groot et al. Underlined the importance of conduct quantitative assessments that are non-monetary. Quantitative non-monetary services are expressed through a variety of indicators by the authors of the studies, such as the percentage or number of participants benefiting from the ecosystem for a given service. Another important result is that reports represented an important proportion of services assessments. They provide significant and valuable information relevant for policy. To sum up, we observe heterogeneity across regions and ecosystem assets. Also, our work revealed the importance of taking reports into account when conducting a literature review or when informing decision-making. Most frequent ecosystem services types, assets, meaning food and opportunity for tourism, are those also which were more often monetarily assessed. Also, cultural services are assessed in 65% of the studies reviewed, but their assessments was mostly qualitative. And when it is possible to compare cultural services to other categories of services, we find that cultural services are systematically valued lower, except for tourism, when assessed in monetary terms. However, using ranking methods, for instance, traditional cultural services are more significantly more often ranked higher than tourism, and also even higher than other ecosystem services. This result suggests that ranking methods seem to be best appropriated to truly capture the importance of cultural services for a wide variety of beneficiaries. Our study emphasizes the need to develop non-monetary indicators to adequately assess cultural services, but also to take them into account when reviewing literature. It also emphasizes the need to take also reports into account. The heterogeneity found across ecosystems and regions suggests that there may be literature gaps. However, this heterogeneity across regions can be partly explained by the fact that there are differences in ecosystem coverage, which declines from west to east. Moreover, we know that marine conservation across the Pacific SIDS mainly focuses on coral reefs. We see grass ecosystem marginalized in conservation legislation and policy. However, Mackenzie et al. Found that the Pacific SIDS appears as a global bright spot for conservation because their seagrasses are particularly resilient. So as we found that seagrasses services were increasingly assessed in Pacific SIDS in recent years, that might encourage seagrass conservation measures in this region. And finally, our work provides a pathway for conducting further systematic reviews of literature, taking into account the complex nature of cultural services. And this method can be replicated to other regions or other type of ecosystems and at different scales. Further analysis remain to be carried out as part of this work. It includes comparison between monetary values when comparable, and an analysis on how the authors of the 57 studies employ the term ecosystem service. So rather as a tool for communication or advocacy, or more as a decision support tool. I would like to thank Tony Bailly, Leo Dutra, and Linwood Pendleton for their contributions to this work. And thank you very much for your attention.